So let's move on. We've got a nice setup here, and I'm just going to paste in the next control that we want, which you may remember is a label or text block and a text box, which we're going to add in just there. So I've got it on my clipboard. So this is in row index 4, which is the 5th row of our form or our page. There, column span, text block, straightforward. Style is exactly the same style as we've used before. The text that we're going to show the user, and the closing tags for the stack panel. Just separate those out so you see what we're doing. Then the next stack panel is exactly as we did in page person. So we've got a grid row 4, column 2, text box, static resource to give it a style, and then we have to give it a name because the user will enter data into this particular text box. They'll enter data in there, and in order for us to harvest it with code, and that's what we call it harvesting the data off the form or off the page, we have to give it a name so that particular control can be found by the code, and then we interrogate what its text value is, and we pinch that off the form and use it in our code. So this is going to illustrate in the next control that we're going to create, which is this label here, or text block, and this little bit here, which is a text block as well, and that allows us to store and change the values. So let's look at what we got. Right, so this is going to illustrate one of the huge advantages of how we use WPF, because I'm going to paste this code in, and you'll see that what I've done is I've first of all defined that text block. Really straightforward. You should understand exactly what's happening there. But what's interesting is when we move on to this next stack panel and the text block that's inside it, this is the style that I'm applying to that particular text block. So the style stops there. If I didn't make use of static resource styles, the potential is that I would have to write this every single time I wanted to stylize an element in the interface. Now you can imagine what the risk of mistake is here, that it would be really easy for us to get some of this wrong, and it would look really bad, and it wouldn't look like the rest of it, and we'd all be a bit confused about why it wasn't right, and you'd hunt forever in trying to find the mistakes. But by using this style system that we've got, this whole set of control setters for the properties of the control are wrapped up inside that name. So instead of having to type this out every single time, we just replace it with the name. Now, in this case, I could have actually started with one of our styles, but this is a kind of one-off. There's nothing else that looks like this on the form. So we've done it once. We said we're going to make this style here, and it's just a one-off. So put up with it. Let's make sure that we just code it correctly. So why does this one get a name? Well, what we're going to do is that at runtime, we're going to make sure that when the add activity takes place, this starts at 0, and when the person adds an activity, this will change value from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because remember, the person can have up to 6 activities. So that's why we're doing that way. So here we are, but apart from that, it's very straightforward, isn't it? You should be able to see exactly how that works, and you should understand that pretty well by now. So let's move on. We've got the count of activities and look back at our design. And there's something hidden from you. What I've done with this is that the count of activities is where we've got to, and we'll move to the buttons which sit at the bottom of the form. And in between there and there, there's a control you can't see, because it has nothing in it until we need to use it at runtime. What it's going to hold is that every time somebody adds an activity, there will be a list of these activities that they've done appearing in the space between the count of activities and the buttons. Really sophisticated design, really good design. Big marks are entered for that. because it's showing that you are considering the needs of the user, and you haven't put, which you would have to do in Windows Forms, you'd have to put a great big space in here that would be big enough to hold all of it, and you'd see this and the buttons would be right at the bottom, and it would look a bit strange. So let's do that now, and what I can do is I can get that additional control that we're going to have, and we're going to put it in here. And this is why the count of columns that we counted when we counted them up on the screen didn't match to the ones that we're actually implementing. So here it is. Right, so stack panel, of course, grid row is specified, column span right across the whole darn lot. Then my text block, and I'm saying font size 24, the name, and a margin. See, when I pick it up here, the text block is actually showing here. And with this beauty of WPF and XAML again is that this will expand to meet our needs. We've already allowed 5 comparative units, a fifth of the whole screen to accommodate its height, and that'll be absolutely no trouble when we get to display text in it. So here's a text block without any text, unlike this text box which has that text. This has no text yet, and we'll create that at runtime in code. Quite a sophisticated method of coding, and it's really good for use in mobile design, particularly where real estate is scarce. So you can see that this is a good way to do it. So that's what we're doing here. So let's put our buttons in. Now, this time round we've got a bit of a problem. We've got 3 columns, if you remember, because we needed to do this distribution of labels and using just a column here and so forth here. But we've got 2 buttons, 3 columns. I can't put 1.5 and 1.5 because these are discrete numbers, index 1, so 0, 1 and 2. So I have to use a particular technique, and it shows you the value of having stack panels in our layout. So let's just paste this in, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk this one through because it kind of matters the way you think about it. So I'm going to paste it in first. Right, so you see we get what we want down here, you can see it. But how did we do it? What we did is we made a stack panel across all of the 3 columns, same as we did before. We did that before with the title. Then inside that stack panel, which spans these 3 columns, it's kind of ignoring the layout we've already got and says, okay, let's have another grid. And this time we define in our grid just 2 columns. We don't need to define a row. The row is always going to be there by default. But we've put in a grid that we can now manage separately to the other grids. The main page grid and the layout grid that we put for these, we can ignore that now and just use these. So I've got my grid column definitions, and there are 2 columns, equal width, closing tag. Now inside that grid I can put a stack panel which is going to be for buttons, and now we're referring to column 0 without having to say it. By explicit, that's this column, whereas this one is in column 1. Not the column 1 that we had here, a different column 1 in a different grid. And this gives you the granularity of control that I've talked about when I've said that complicated layouts can be created using WPF. This would be almost impossible to do with a Windows Form application and still allow our application to be responsive when it moves to an interface that's of a different shape or size to the one for which we designed it. This is hugely important for us in terms of thinking about responsive design. And that's one of the great things I want you to talk about when you're talking about things in your essays, is that responsive design is the future, because you never know what size of device the user is going to pick up and use. It used to be you could say that everything was 1024 by 768. You could have a very good chance of saying that that'll be the ratio, that'll be the proportions, but think about how many different ratios and sizes and proportions we use in our interfaces now. Some are landscape, some are portrait, and so forth. Some are just got odd sizes. So that's the great advantage of what we're doing here. So we've now completed the GUI for form activity, and what we'll do next is we'll create the GUI for form summary, which I think will probably only take one video, but I'll see how it goes. And then we can move on to the next part of the code development.